An impish, wild child of the stars, beholden only to his own caprices. What could be more terrifying? Now, I think a lot of people would hesitate to call the Collector more terrifying than Belos. Which is interesting considering that he is capable of just as much destruction, if not more so. Belos has at least a coherent ideology, a core set of beliefs that he steadfastly, dogmatically commits himself to. Luce knows that he does not have nearly as much antagonism toward other humans, so she uses that to her advantage. The Collector is much more volatile. He wants to play, but he is very mercurial, constantly getting bored, and constantly changing his mind, just like the kid he so resembles. Even if we do find Kantian ideas a little bit restrictive, I do think that they continue to hold a deep resonance to us. We have a hard time shaking the idea that the motives and basic worldview and philosophical perspective undergirding one's actions are as important as the actions themselves. Goodness for goodness' sake is different from goodness for the sake of material gain. And Kant was a steadfast holder of that position, even in circumstances when it could be a bit absurd. In a common response to Kantian maxims, for instance, you have the idea of the murderer at the door. Can you lie to the murderer who is going to try to kill you? Kant would say no, because that would not be a good in of itself. Lying is wrong. We would not wish for others to lie. We would not want to enforce the idea that lying is morally acceptable. So, according to Kant's precepts, we must tell the truth, even if it is in such an absurd circumstance as this that could possibly lead to the deaths of us or others. In this perspective, Kant's ideas are a little absurd. But then there are other circumstances in which there is a bit more nuance at play. Think about Kant's rebuttal to David Hume. Hume talks about how, for instance, we are nice to people we don't particularly care about at a dinner party, holding up that ideal of politeness and politesse, not because we believe it's a good in of itself, but because we believe that's what works best for the group as a whole, and thus we benefit from that. In that circumstance, what's best for the group is what's best for us, since we are a part of that group. But for Kant, this whole idea is a bit self-serving and even dangerous, because it prioritizes what the individual believes is good for them on a practical level above what Kant values, which is a universal sense of duty. You make the choices that you make because they are the ones that you must make, because they are the universally moral choices that one must commit oneself to. Now, this Kantian perspective does have some validity because it prevents people from wiggling out of their moral duty by pursuing their self-interests instead. It is much less prone to manipulation. Motive and purpose are significant for Kant. They are essential to the basic morality of an action completely outside the consequences of that action. And I do think that this idea is one that resonates with a lot of us. Belos acts out of pure malice. He views witches as immoral polluters of the universe, baleful and monstrous creatures, and so he wants to be rid of them. He acts from that dark, sinister place. The Collector has no malice in him. He can be petty and capricious and petulant, like a child, and when he believes that he has been wronged, he wants to avenge himself on the person he believes has done wrong to him, as we see with Belos. But he does not have any real moral sense. He does not have a coherent set of beliefs from which he acts, unlike Belos. He simply is like a willow swaying in the wind, acting according to whatever vicissitudes and caprices occur to him. And we tend to be a little more forgiving of this point of view, and thus it's sensible that you see a lot more people willing to apologize for the Collector than apologize for Belos. The Collector, after all, is sincerely lonely, and he does want to play with others, and he has no real desire to hurt anyone. But to what extent does that matter? To what extent is having no real coherent moral system and just pursuing whatever pleasures occur to one better than acting from a moral system based on moral precepts that we find atrocious and cruel? The Collector is an innocent hedonist. He does not think about what he wants in the long term. He simply acts according to the circumstances that immediately present themselves to him. He seeks an unending rush of joy and excitement, and because his thinking is so focused on the short term, he becomes bored very quickly, and he needs a new sense of adventure, a new sense of fun and pleasure. And because of this constant cycle of playful hedonism, constantly chasing pleasure as this primordial good, he is more unpredictable than Belos, which is, to a certain extent, something that makes him less harrowing to a lot of our perspectives, because he is not someone who has this megalomaniacal plan to take over the world. He's not a genocidal maniac. But he's also very unpredictable. He can be controlled and manipulated, because again, he has the perspective of a child, but he cannot be fully contained. Belos is a Platonist in a lot of ways. He has his grandiose moral system that needs to be enforced with rigid, hierarchical, systematic viewpoints and actions and precepts that prevent the entire structure that he idealizes from collapsing. There is a single, pure, unsullied, perfect world for Belos, and any creatures that disrupt that perfect world, like witches, are in the wrong. They are monsters who must be eliminated for the sanctity of that world to be preserved and maintained. Like Plato, he sees all change and all variance from that fixed, purified, celestially perfect system that he has in mind as decay and degradation. That is an authoritarian viewpoint, but is it necessarily more disturbing than the Collector's anarchic willfulness? He knows no rules and no moral systems. When he despises Belos, he kills him without a second thought. When he wants to move the moon, he does. When he has in his mind to destroy and warp the world in order to create the perfect environment for him to play a game, that's what he does. He has no capacity for moderation or modulation. He simply has an impulse and acts on it. He does not consider the world outside his own limited perspective. He does not consider the values and viewpoints of others while trying to create an informed perspective for himself. He simply relies on his narrow, immediate, constrained sense of self, isolated from the values and ideas of others. Whatever he wants, he takes it. Whatever he wants to destroy, he does. When we think of hedonists, we typically think of an unsatiable desire for sex or drugs or luxuriant food. But the collector is a different kind of hedonist. He is not possessed by these cravings. They do not draw him away from the good, and they do not become necessarily the good in of themselves. He does not view them as pure and the main motive for living. He simply sees no reason to not constantly chase them. They are the entirety of his world. He has these little caprices and he follows them. Both kinds of hedonists, of course, are different from Epicureans. I would consider someone like Ida an Epicurean. Like hedonists, an Epicurean, in the Lucretian sense of the term, does not pride themselves on adhering to these lofty, abstract moral principles. They do not devote themselves to higher powers or celestial beings or dogmas and moral codes that take the place of such celestial beings. And they love enjoying themselves and pursuing their own desires. But the difference is an Epicurean accepts the transience of all things. They understand that the world is volatile and in a constant state of transition and movement and flux. These pleasures are thus not going to bring you any more lasting fulfillment than grandiose, abstract moral convictions. Instead, one has to look outward at oneself and those around one, at the real material truth of the world, and make one's judgments and actions from that actual physical material world. Hopefully the collector can become more like Ida and our team, and less like a pure hedonist pursuing his every whim, regardless of the effects of doing so on others. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this. Keep watching The Owl House. It's a great show, and I can't wait to see what they do with it in Season 3. Anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon. Promise you that. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.